He was the coldest man in Boston, until an inexperienced nanny with a painful past made his son smile and taught his frozen heart how to love again. Hello, my friends. Before we delve into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please drop a comment below and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the soul. Now, let's begin. The Boston skyline, a jagged line of historic brick and modern glass, stood as a stoic guardian against the biting November wind whipping off the Atlantic. The bare branches of ancient elms in the public garden clawed at a sky the color of slate, a sky that promised an early, unforgiving winter. This raw, historic beauty was utterly lost on Alistair Blackwood. For him, the only landscapes that held any meaning were the sharp, ascending lines of stock market charts and the architectural models of the corporate towers his private equity firm, Blackwood Capital, acquired and flipped. Like chess pieces across the global board, at 36, Alistair was an architect of financial empires, a CEO whose mind operated with the cold, intricate precision of a luxury chronograph, and whose heart, the whispers in the city's most exclusive boardrooms claimed, had been carved from a block of New England granite. Pain, he had learned in the most brutal way imaginable, was an unacceptable liability. Since the death of his wife, Eleanor, in a tragic sailing accident off the coast of Nantucket 2 years prior, he had entombed his grief behind a fortress of obsessive work, calculated detachment, and an emotional frost that repelled everyone without exception. His world had contracted into a relentless cycle of transatlantic flights, hostile takeovers, and million-dollar decisions. A perpetual high-stakes flight from a sorrow he refused to name, let alone feel. The single, fragile thread connecting Alistair Blackwood to his own buried humanity was his son, Finian. Finn, a small, 6-year-old boy with wide, searching eyes, the exact shade of the sea that had stolen his mother. Yet for Alistair, fatherhood had become another portfolio to be managed, another responsibility to be outsourced rather than a bond to be nurtured. He loved his son, of that he was certain, but this love manifested as a series of flawless material provisions. Enrollment at the most prestigious private school in Beacon Hill, a bedroom overflowing with the latest European toys, and a trust fund that could withstand a global recession. Time, affection, patience, these were the resources he lacked, the duties he delegated to a revolving door of highly qualified nannies. Each one, competent and credentialed, lasted only a few weeks within the oppressive silence of their historic brownstone on Louisburg Square. Alistair's impossible standards, his intolerance for the slightest imperfection, and the profound, unspoken sadness that clung to little Finn like a shroud, created an atmosphere that was simply unsustainable. None could penetrate the boy's wall of silence or the father's armor of indifference. And so, the cycle of hiring and firing spun on, deepening the chasm of loneliness that separated father and son. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Alistair's armor showed a visible crack. He stood in his corner office on the 45th floor of a skyscraper in the financial district. The city spread below him like a map of his own dominion. Yet, his mind was miles away. From the quarterly reports and leveraged buyout proposals on his vast mahogany desk, his executive assistant, a sharp young man named Marcus, tried to gently steer his attention back to the day's agenda. "Mr. Blackwood, the call with the Tokyo office is in 10 minutes. Shall I patch them through to the conference room?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with caution. Alistair rubbed his temples, his expression dark. "No, Marcus, cancel it. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. The concern in..." His voice was raw, a rare glimpse of the father behind the financier. "I just got a call from the school nurse. Finn has a fever again. The boy's fragile health, his recurring medically inexplicable fevers, were the one variable Alistair could not control, the one ghost his fortune and power could not exercise. Miles away, in a vibrant, working-class neighborhood of South Boston, Clara Maeve O'Connell was carefully folding her acceptance letter to Boston University's master's program in English literature and placing it in a drawer filled with deferred dreams. At 25, Clara's reality was a crushing equation of suffocating responsibilities and postponed aspirations. Having graduated summa cum laude from UMass Boston, her passion lay in the poetry of Emily Dickinson and Robert Frost, but she now faced the urgent, non-negotiable need for a full-time job, any job, to support her household. Her mother, a seamstress with hands gnarled by arthritis but a spirit still fierce, required an experimental and prohibitively expensive treatment for a worsening lung condition. The advertisement, found on a generic job board, felt like a message from another universe. Nanny required for 6-year-old boy in Beacon Hill residence. High-profile family, generous salary and benefits. It seemed both a lifeline and a cruel joke. She had no formal experience with wealthy children. Her world was one of street hockey, library books, and an imagination forged in necessity. But desperation, as it so often had in her life, screamed louder than her insecurities. She applied, driven more by a prayer for her mother's health than by any real conviction, half hoping she would never get a call back. The first encounter between Clara O'Connell and Alistair Blackwood was as cold and impersonal as the polished marble of the foyer in his Beacon Hill brownstone. She arrived precisely on time, wearing her one good interview dress, a simple navy blue sheath whose quiet dignity felt out of place amidst the silent opulence of antique furniture and abstract art. She perched on the edge of a minimalist sofa that likely cost more than her mother's entire medical fund, feeling small and utterly transparent. Alistair made her wait for exactly 17 minutes, a power play that, while perhaps unintentional, perfectly reflected his worldview that his time was infinitely more valuable than hers. When he finally emerged from a home office, he barely looked up from the tablet he held. His presence was overwhelming. The cut of his cashmere sweater, the quiet confidence in his posture, the aura of absolute authority that radiated from him. "Miss O'Connell, I presume," he said, his voice a low baritone, devoid of any warmth. He didn't offer to shake her hand. "The agency's file says you have a degree in poetry, which strikes me as utterly useless for this position. But their psychologist seems to think you possess a high degree of empathy. I'll be direct. The last nanny lasted 19 days. My son Finn is selective. If he responds to you, you have the job. If he doesn't, the agency will have your check for the day's trial in the mail. Any questions?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. His coldness was a physical force, more biting than the wind outside. But she took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and met his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "No questions, Mr. Blackwood, perfectly clear." Her terse, direct response, devoid of the fawning subservience or nervous rambling he was used to, seemed, for a fraction of a second, to pierce his armor. He finally lifted his gaze from the tablet and truly looked at her for the first time. He saw large, intelligent green eyes, a determined set to her jaw, and a complete lack of intimidation. A flicker of surprise crossed his steely features before he dismissed her, turning his attention back to his screen as if she had already ceased to exist. Contrary to all of Alistair's expectations and perhaps even her own, the bond between Clara and little Finn Blackwood was instantaneous, almost preternatural. When she was led into the boys' room, she found a child with haunted eyes and slumped shoulders, surrounded by a mountain of screens and electronic gadgets, yet radiating a loneliness so profound it was almost a physical presence. Instead of trying to win him over with loud games or false enthusiasm, as the nannies before her had, Clara simply sat on the floor, a respectful distance away. In a low, soft voice, she began to tell him a story she invented on the spot. It was a tale about a small sparrow who lived in the Boston Common and was afraid of the loud noises of the city, but who dreamed of learning the songs of the sailors down at the harbor. Clara's gentle cadence, the rich tapestry of details she wove, and the tenderness with which she described the lonely sparrow's fears and hopes seemed to cast a spell over the boy. Slowly, Finn put down his tablet. He crept closer, his eyes wide and fixed on her face, completely absorbed in the narrative. That afternoon, they didn't touch a single expensive toy. Instead, they built a fortress of pillows to be the sparrow's nest, drew maps of the Boston Common on construction paper, and together they imagined a brave ending for their little hero. When Alistair returned home late that night, long after the city had gone dark, he walked in on a scene he hadn't witnessed in 2 years. His son, usually withdrawn and silent in his presence, came sprinting towards him, his face alight with an emotion Alistair barely recognized. Joy. "Dad! Dad! You won't believe it. Clara told me a story that isn't on the iPad or in any of my books. She made it up, Dad. Just for me." The pure, unadulterated delight in Finn's voice was a sound that echoed in the vast, empty chambers of Alistair's heart. And though he remained skeptical, a reluctant seed of curiosity was planted. A curiosity about this quiet young woman who, in a single afternoon, had achieved what a legion of child psychologists and experienced caregivers had failed to do in years. She had made his son genuinely smile. In the days that followed, Clara's presence began to subtly yet profoundly recalibrate the cold, sterile atmosphere of the Blackwood brownstone. She was not a loud or invasive force. On the contrary, she moved with a quiet grace and a serene self-possession that, paradoxically, made her influence all the more potent. Alistair, accustomed to nannies who either filled the house with the grating sounds of children's television or tried to engage him in forced, sycophantic conversations, found himself observing the small, defining details of Clara's character. He noticed that after Finn was asleep, she didn't retreat to the staff quarters to watch the massive flat-screen television. Instead, she would curl up in a worn armchair in the corner of his cavernous library, a volume of poetry with a faded cover in her hands lost to the world. Sometimes she would just sit by the window with headphones on, her eyes closed, listening to what he later discovered were old Irish folk songs, their melancholic melodies a stark contrast to the aggressive tempo of his own life. He noticed too that she cooked, not just for Finn but for herself, simple, fragrant dishes, stews, shepherd's pies, fresh-baked soda bread, whose warm, comforting aromas felt alien and yet deeply welcome in a house that usually smelled only of lemon polish and old money. She was, above all, quiet, but her silence was not one of fear or submission. It was the composed silence of an observer, of someone comfortable in her own skin, who didn't feel the need to fill every empty space with noise. This silence began to intrigue and, in a strange way, unsettle Alistair. "Are you always this quiet?" he asked one evening, finding her in the library. The question slipped out, bypassing the usual filters of his calculated speech. Clara looked up from her book, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I'm not quiet, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "I just save my words for people who are actually listening." The response, once again, disarmed him with its simple, profound truth. It left him with the unnerving sensation that, for all his success in commanding boardrooms and intimidating rivals, he may have never truly learned how to listen to another human being in his entire life. The first significant crack in the glacier surrounding Alistair's heart appeared on a raw, rain-lashed Thursday night. He'd come home late, soaked and foul-tempered after a brutal negotiation had fallen through. He expected to find the house dark and silent, Finn already asleep. Instead, he walked into the formal dining room to an unexpected sight. The long, intimidating table was set for 3, not with the formal silver and crystal, but with simple placemats. Finn, his eyes shining with excitement, ran to him. "Dad, you're home. I asked Clara if we could wait for you. Please have dinner with us. She made the pie you told me Nana Eleanor used to make." The mention of Eleanor, so rare from his son, and the desperate plea in the boy's eyes, were impossible to refuse. Alistair, who normally ate a solitary meal over spreadsheets in his office, found himself sitting at the head of his own table, feeling like a guest in his own home. The dinner was stilted at first, but slowly, guided by Clara's gentle questions and Finn's excited chatter, the tension began to melt away. At Finn's request, Clara told one of her stories, this one about a grumpy old owl in the Arnold Arboretum who thought he was too clever for everyone until a little firefly taught him how to see in the dark. The way she modulated her voice for the different characters, her expressive hands painting pictures in the air, and the way Finn hung on her every word, laughing and adding his own details, created a small, perfect bubble of warmth and joy. And then, something extraordinary happened. Alistair Blackwood, the man who never laughed, the CEO whose only expression of mirth was a cynical smirk, let out a real, deep-bellied laugh. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound that echoed in the grand dining room, surprising himself most of all. In that moment, hearing the sound of his own forgotten happiness, he saw with blinding clarity just how barren his life had become. And he felt a confusing, overwhelming sense of gratitude for this quiet young woman who, with her stories and her shepherd's pie, was slowly, painstakingly bringing light back into his home and his heart. The turning point in Alistair's perception of Clara, the moment curiosity and admiration began to morph into something deeper, something more unsettling, arrived on a melancholy, rain-swept Sunday. Trapped indoors, the three of them were spread out on the Persian rug in the living room with paper and colored pencils. Finn, his imagination now firing on all cylinders, was drawing a fantastical world of sea monsters in Boston Harbor, with Clara helping him with colors and shapes. Alistair, initially a distant observer, found himself drawn in, a childish urge to be part of their circle of affection, overcoming his usual reserve. It was then, amidst a light-hearted debate about whether a sea monster would prefer to eat a lobster roll or a cannoli from the North End, that Finn, with the guileless, brutal innocence of a child, dropped a sentence that landed like a stone in the quiet room. "Daddy, did you know Clara's afraid of kisses?" Alistair, who was attempting to draw a sailboat that looked more like a deformed bathtub, froze, his pencil hovering mid-air. He looked from his son's untroubled face to Clara, whose own face had suddenly been drained of all color. "What do you mean, buddy? Afraid of kisses?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light, but a strange tension had electrified the air. Finn, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, continued matter-of-factly. "Yeah, the other day I gave her a big loud kiss on her cheek and she got all funny. Then she told me that sometimes kisses can be dangerous, that they can hurt people on the inside." The innocent remark hung in the air, thick with a meaning Alistair couldn't yet grasp, but instinctively knew was profound and painful. He looked at Clara. She had stopped drawing and was now staring at a knot in the rug, her expression shuttered, her posture suddenly small and defensive. A curtain had been drawn, revealing a flicker of a deep, hidden wound. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a desire to erase his son's words, but it was coupled with an overwhelming need to understand. What could make someone fear a kiss? He realized with a jolt that there was a story there, a key to the puzzle of this woman who captivated him more each day. Sensing his questioning gaze, Clara finally looked up, her voice soft, but with a finality that closed the subject. "Children, Mr. Blackwood. They sometimes understand the world in ways we adults have forgotten." She forced a small, tight smile and turned her attention back to Finn's drawing, leaving Alistair with a disquieting new image of her. The capable nanny had been replaced by a woman with a haunted past, a woman who, for some tragic reason, had learned to fear one of the most fundamental acts of human affection. And this discovery, instead of pushing him away, drew him in further, igniting a powerful, primitive desire to understand and, if he could, to protect. The opportunity for a new, devastatingly intimate revelation came unexpectedly, during another night when Finn's mysterious illness returned with a vengeance. The boy was burning with fever, tossing and turning, his small cries echoing in the large, dark house. Clara was a pillar of calm strength, sitting by his bedside for hours, applying cool compresses, whispering stories, and monitoring his temperature with a devotion that humbled Alistair. Exhausted, well past midnight, she finally drifted off to sleep in the uncomfortable armchair by the bed, her head slumped at an awkward angle, a book of poems forgotten in her lap. Alistair, who had been pacing the halls like a caged animal, entered the room and saw her there, so vulnerable in her sleep. A wave of tenderness washed over him. He retrieved a soft cashmere throw from a chest at the foot of the bed and with infinite care draped it over her shoulders. The light, gentle touch of the blanket was enough. Her eyes flew open, wide with a raw, primal panic. Her body went rigid, coiled like a spring, ready to fight off an unseen attacker. "Easy, Clara. It's just me. It's Alistair," he said quickly, his voice a low whisper, taking a step back to give her space. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. You looked cold." Recognition dawned, and the terror in her eyes was replaced by a wave of profound embarrassment. She sat up straight, her face flushed with shame at her overreaction. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I don't know why I did that. It's just—" She trailed off, wrestling with words that wouldn't come. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it, she confessed, more to herself than to him, "I don't think I've ever been touched with care before, only in a hurry, or with guilt, or with a purpose that wasn't my own." The confession, so raw, so full of a history of pain, hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow. It was another piece of the puzzle, a piece that spoke of a deep and terrible betrayal, opening another crack in the door to her secret past. The bond forged in that crucible of late-night fever and shared vulnerability solidified in the following days. A few afternoons later, as they watched Finn chase squirrels in the public garden, Clara, feeling perhaps for the first time that she was in a safe harbor, chose to open her heart. "Alistair," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "What I said the other night about being touched, I feel I owe you an explanation." He simply nodded, his silence an invitation, not a demand. And with a courage that stunned him, she told him. She spoke of her teenage years in South Boston, of a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and of an older man, a friend of her family, who was trusted and respected. A man who had taken a special interest in her, encouraging her studies, praising her intelligence, and she told him of the day he had cornered her in the narrow hallway of their triple-decker apartment building, under the guise of giving her a book, and had pressed his mouth to hers. A kiss that was not a kiss. It was an act of theft, a violation. "He told me it was because he cared so much about me," she said, her voice thick with the memory. "When I started to cry, he told me I was being dramatic, that I had led him on, that a smart girl like me should know how the world works. He made me feel dirty, ashamed. He silenced me by making me believe it was my fault." She finally turned to look at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Ever since that day, a man's touch has felt like a warning. Intimacy feels like a trap. Alistair was speechless. He felt a white-hot, useless rage toward the ghost of that man, but it was dwarfed by an immense compassion for the woman beside him. A woman who, despite carrying this wound, radiated nothing but gentleness and care toward his son. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with that. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for what you went through." He looked away toward the elegant arch of the George Washington statue. "For 2 years, I thought my heart was the most heavily guarded fortress in this city. But your heart, Clara, it wasn't just locked away, it was robbed, and that is an unspeakable cruelty." His words, his empathy, his complete and utter lack of judgment were a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. It was the beginning of a connection she never thought possible. But the delicate ecosystem of trust they were building was about to face a hurricane. Alistair's former mother-in-law, Beatrice Davenport, matriarch of one of Boston's oldest and wealthiest families, announced one of her infrequent imperial visits to see her grandson. Beatrice, a woman of impeccable style and venomous charm, had always maintained a strained relationship with Alistair, whom she subtly blamed for her daughter's death. She swept into the brownstone and found a scene that immediately set her on edge. Alistair, Clara and Finn sitting together in the library, laughing as Finn recounted one of Clara's stories. The air of easy, genuine domesticity was something Beatrice had not seen in that house since before Eleanor's death, and she instantly perceived Clara not as a caregiver, but as a usurper, a girl from the wrong neighborhood with an agenda. Throughout her visit, she treated Clara with a frosty, dismissive disdain, making pointed remarks about the help getting too familiar. After Clara had taken Finn upstairs for his bath, Beatrice wasted no time in deploying her poison. "Alistair, darling, I worry about you, about the stability of this house for my grandson," she began, her voice a silken weapon. "This familiarity you're allowing with the nanny, it isn't appropriate. Can you not see what's happening? She's a classic case, a pretty, ambitious girl from Southie looking for a way out. She's using your grief and my grandson as a ladder. A man of your intelligence, your experience with predatory people, surely you can't be this naive. Wake up, Alistair. End this before she sinks her claws in any deeper and causes this family even more pain." Her words, cruel and dripping with classist prejudice, struck a nerve deep inside Alistair. The old wounds of betrayal, the fear of being made a fool of, the cynical logic of the ruthless businessman, it all came roaring back to the surface. Doubt, a cold and venomous weed, began to choke the fragile new feelings that had been growing in his heart. The man he was trying to leave behind began to wage war against the man he was becoming. Tormented by Beatrice's words and haunted by his own ghosts, Alistair made a fatal miscalculation. That night, he confronted Clara, his voice laced with the cold suspicion she hadn't heard in months, a tone that hurt her more than a physical blow ever could. "Clara, I need you to be honest with me," he began, his formality a wall between them. "What is your endgame here? What do you really want? Is it me, or is it just this?" He gestured vaguely around the opulent room. "A more comfortable life? An escape route? Are you using my son to get to my bank account?" The accusation, so baseless and unfair, struck Clara dumb. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, and a pain so sharp it took her breath away. You really think that of me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "After everything? After I showed you the most broken parts of my soul, you think I'm capable of that?" The tears she refused to shed for Beatrice now flowed freely. "If all I wanted was comfort, Alistair, do you really think I would have chosen this job? To care for the son of a man who had forgotten how to smile? To try and heal a heart as broken and terrified as your own?" She didn't wait for an answer. The pain of his distrust was unbearable. It was proof that deep down he still saw her as the girl from the wrong side of the tracks. With her heart shattered and her dignity in tatters, she made the only choice she could. "I cannot stay in a house where I'm not trusted, where my heart is put on trial." She straightened her back, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "I quit, Mr. Blackwood, As of tomorrow morning, you will need to find someone else to take care of your son and your heart." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alistair standing alone. In the silent library, the echo of her words crashing down around him, the weight of his own monumental, unforgivable mistake already beginning to crush him. Clara's departure was as quiet and unobtrusive as her arrival. She was gone before the first hint of dawn colored the sky over the harbor, leaving behind only her key on the kitchen counter and a vast, echoing emptiness that immediately seeped into the very walls of the house. When Finn woke and found Clara's room empty, a child's deep, instinctual panic took hold. "Dad, where's Clara?" he asked, his small voice trembling with a fear Alistair hadn't heard in months. Alistair, his own throat tight with a mixture of regret and dread, tried to explain gently that Clara wouldn't be working for them anymore. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The light in Finn's eyes, which had so recently been rekindled, was extinguished. He retreated into a profound, desolate silence, refusing to eat, refusing to play, refusing to go to school. He would simply sit on the floor of his room, clutching the hand-drawn map of the Boston Common they had made together, his small shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The joy Clara had so carefully cultivated vanished, and the old, familiar sadness returned, more potent than ever. The house itself seemed to be in mourning. The silence that Alistair had once craved now felt oppressive, accusatory. There were no more warm, comforting scents coming from the kitchen, no more soft folk music drifting from the library, no more stories about brave sparrows or wise owls. There was only the cold, sterile perfection he had once mistaken for order. He saw, with agonizing clarity, that it wasn't just Finn who was lost without her. He was lost too. He missed the sound of her turning a page in the library. He missed the way she would bite her lip when concentrating on one of Finn's drawings. He missed the intelligent spark in her eyes when they discussed a book or an idea. He missed her quiet strength, her unwavering empathy, her ability to see the man buried beneath the monster. He realized with a wave of panic so intense it nearly brought him to his knees that Clara O'Connell was not just his son's nanny. She was the woman who had methodically dismantled his defenses, who had taught him how to feel again, who had healed wounds he didn't even know were still bleeding. She was the woman he, Alistair Blackwood, who had renounced love and sworn himself to a life of emotional exile, had fallen irrevocably and completely in love with. And he, in a single act of breathtaking stupidity and cowardice, had driven her away. He had wounded her with the cruelest weapon he could find, his suspicion, and confirmed her deepest fear, that the world of men was a place of danger and betrayal. The regret that consumed him was a living entity, a pain far sharper than the grief he'd felt for Eleanor, because this loss, this gaping wound, was entirely self-inflicted. He had found something impossibly rare, and in his fear he had shattered it. The breaking point came 3 days after she left. Finn, listless and pale, had developed another fever. As Alistair sat by his son's bed, placing a cool cloth on his forehead, Finn opened his eyes. They weren't filled with anger, but with a deep, heartbreaking sorrow. "If Clara can't live here," the little boy whispered, his voice raspy, "then you have to go away. I want her back, not you." The words struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. It was the absolute, unvarnished truth. He was the poison in his own home. He was the reason for his son's suffering. In that moment, the CEO died. The ruthless financier vanished. All that was left was a father and a man staring into the abyss of his own making. Determined to fix what he had broken, moved by his son's anguish and the crushing weight of his own loss, Alistair Blackwood made a decision. He would tear down the last pillar of his pride. After a tense phone call in which he used the full force of his influence to persuade the nanny agency to give him her address, he set out to do the one thing he had never done in his adult life. beg. He took Finn with him, who, upon hearing they were going to find Clara, showed the first flicker of life in days. On the way, Alistair stopped at a small corner florist in the North End and, in a gesture that felt both alien and essential, bought a simple, slightly wild-looking bouquet of white daisies, remembering a poem by Dickinson she had once read to Finn about their simple honesty. The drive from the pristine, manicured elegance of Beacon Hill to the dense, triple-decker-lined streets of South Boston felt like a journey to another country. When he found her building and climbed the worn wooden steps, his heart hammered in his chest. Clara herself opened the door. When she saw him standing there, holding their son's hand, the bouquet of daisies looking small and fragile in his other hand, her face was a mask of shock, caution, and a deep, lingering hurt. "Alistair, Finn, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice quiet, protective. Before she could say more, Alistair did something that stripped away every last vestige of his former self. He sank to his knees on the worn linoleum of her hallway, bringing himself to his son's level, his eyes looking up at hers in complete surrender. The gesture, so utterly humbling, stunned her into silence. "Clara, we came to ask for your forgiveness," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I'm not here as your former employer. I'm here as a man. A foolish, cowardly man who made the worst mistake of his life. I let my own fear and the poison of another person turn me into a monster. I accused you of the one thing I knew in my soul wasn't true, and in doing so, I betrayed your trust. And I broke my own heart, and I broke our son's heart." He looked at Finn, then back at her. "Please, forgive me. Forgive us. And if there is any space left for me in your heart, please give us a chance to build something real, together. I love you, Clara. I was just too much of a coward to see it until I had thrown it all away." His words, his raw humility, Finn's small hand gripping his tightly, the simple offering of daisies, it was all too much for Clara's own wounded heart. The tears she had been holding back for days finally came, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of a confusing, overwhelming flood, of relief, of hope, and of the terrifying prospect of letting her guard down again. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice trembling, I'm still so scared. Scared you'll hurt me again. Scared our worlds are too different to ever truly meet." He rose to his feet, and with a gentleness she now knew was his true nature, he reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I'm scared too," he confessed. "But the fear of living a life without you in it is 1,000 times worse than any other fear I have. And when I'm with you, that fear gets smaller, it almost disappears." Finn, sensing this was the crucial moment, let go of his father's hand and stretched his small arms toward Clara. "Please come home, Clara," he pleaded, his voice small and clear. "The house has no color without you." That simple, heartfelt plea from the little boy, combined with the raw sincerity shining in Alistair's eyes, finally washed away her last defenses. A tentative smile, like the first flower of spring after a long winter, blossomed on her face. She accepted his apology, and more importantly, she accepted the chance to begin again. 6 months later, the Blackwood brownstone was a different world. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the sound of Finn's laughter, the melody of Alistair playing the piano again after years of neglect, and the warm, delicious aromas of Clara's cooking. With Alistair's unwavering support, she was excelling in her literature program at Boston University, her brilliant mind finally given the space to soar. Finn, enveloped in the constant, secure love of 2 present and devoted parents, was a happy, thriving child. His mysterious fevers had vanished completely, proving they had only ever been a symptom of a heart chilled by loneliness. On the marble mantelpiece in the living room, a single silver frame now held a photo taken on a sunny autumn day at Walden Pond. The 3 of them, arm in arm, their faces alight with pure, uncomplicated, Joy, the perfect image of a family rebuilt on a foundation of forgiveness, trust, and love. One clear, crisp evening, Alistair and Clara stood on the rooftop deck he'd had built, looking out at the glittering expanse of the Boston skyline. Finn was fast asleep downstairs, safe and sound. A comfortable, peaceful silence rested between them, a testament to how far they had come. It was Clara who broke it. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the city lights with a newfound confidence and a serene resolve. "Alistair," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I'm ready." He knew instantly what she meant. It was the final piece, the closing of the circle, the one step they had, patiently, respectfully, been waiting for her to be ready to take. He moved closer, his gaze full of a love so profound it felt like a prayer. He cupped her face in his hands, and he kissed her. It was a kiss unlike any other. It held none of the violation of her past, none of the arrogance of his. It was tender, questioning, and deep. It was a promise, a homecoming, a kiss of profound and breathtaking care. And for the first time in her life, as his lips met hers under the vast, starry New England sky, Clara Maeve O'Connell felt no fear. She only felt peace. She felt safe. She felt, at long last, that she was home.